I'm from like a river area, so needless to say, we do a lot of fishing. And I learned only today that here the traditional way is to put down bark before cutting, so that the fish doesn't like slippy slide all around. And if I knew that like strategy of approaching the same task we've done for thousands of years, I would have been like carrying bark home every fishing season. So I'm looking forward to learning and hearing with all of you today other things we can pinpoint in terms of like policy. And that is what I've got for you. I hope it suffices and like sets the scene. With that, let's move now to Ine. Is that right?
Thanks, Chanel. Thanks for opening us up with that land acknowledgement. We're here, to talk tonight at this fireside chat about the Thrive Act, and in particular, one of the pillars of the Thrive Act being strengthening and healing the nation-to-nation relationship with Native nations, with sovereign Native nations, right? So in the Thrive Act, this is like an amazing, probably one of the more bold, the more aggressive pieces of legislation, proposed legislation to address climate change, but not only climate change, to address the inequities that have spurred from colonization, have spurred from a capitalism that has really marginalized Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And so there's a lot in this Thrive agenda that is around equity, around labor, and bringing unions in. But a big part of this Thrive agenda is also around strengthening Native nations, sovereign Native nations. And that is, as Indigenous nations, as Native nations, we're also not, we're political entities. We're political entities, not just, racial groups as well. So that has its own differences and uniqueness in this country. So how do we address all of that in climate legislation, and how does that look in Alaska, particularly for Alaska Native nations? Before we dive into this chat, and we have some great folks on our chat tonight, I hope folks who are joining feel like they can be a part of this chat, but we have some really great leaders of tribal governance, tribal entities in the space tonight to really dive into some juicy questions. But I want to just pass this over briefly to Ruth to give us just a brief rundown of where this legislation is at. Why are we having this conversation right now? Pass that over to you, Ruth.
Hello everyone, Ruth Miller-Shi'iji. My name is Ruth, and I'm a Dena'ina woman, daughter of Lloyd and Heather Miller. But today I'm calling in from Salish Kootenai lands here in Montana. Though I just this morning was on my homelands in Denaakk'e, otherwise known as Anchorage, Alaska. I am the Climate Justice Director for Native Movement, and also our state lead for coordinating our activities around the Thrive agenda. So let's take this from kind of step by step, and I think that'll be a little bit easier to contextualize our conversation today. So the Thrive Act is a piece of proposed legislation. It's in the editing process, and grassroots communities through a network of different coalitions are working with legislative staffers to fine-tune language that represents us. And the urgency is because we are, as a country, recovering from not just a post-COVID crisis or mid-COVID crisis, but also, an economic downturn and impending climate chaos. And so the recovery packages that President Biden and his administration are pushing right now are really, really crucial to determine what kind of rebuilding will be done and who will be prioritized. and whose interests will be protected. And so the Thrive Act is one aspect of the efforts of thousands and thousands of different grassroots organizations, of which the Just Transition Collective participates in, working to take this moment and take charge to make sure that our values and our justice-informed lens is first and foremost in those recovery considerations. So this Thrive Act is split into 8 pillars, which are part of like a larger agenda. It's called the Thrive Agenda, and you can find more at thriveagenda.org, which I had just dropped in the chat. Just kidding, I am now dropping it in the chat. And these 8 pillars delineate different approaches to recovery in a justice-centered way. So there are pillars that really elevate the importance of justice for workers and healthy unions that are able to advocate for equality amongst workers. There are other pillars like ours that talk about racial justice and specifically elevating tribal sovereign nations and repairing the nation-to-nation relationship that obviously has been nothing but fractured and harmful in the past. And there are more pillars about a care economy and justice for economic transition. And so we are taking these pillars step by step, day by day, to host conversations with our own community, because even if the Thrive Act doesn't pass, we already are doing this work. We are already experts in these fields. We've been working on food sovereignty since time immemorial. We've been working on justice for workers. We've been working on bettering Alaska and making Alaska more reflective of us and our value systems. And so as the Just Transition Collective, we wanted to bring together spaces for dialogue so that we can take a hold of this moment with this act that will be hopefully to the fore by the end of April, the floor of Congress by the end of April, and will ideally be incorporated into Biden's second recovery package by the 4th of July. But we also want to build healthy foundations, building on conversations that we've all been having and work that we've all been doing for decades to make sure that these issues are not just about one act being passed in DC, but really start to build power amongst our community. So if anyone has any specific questions about the Thrive Act or the agenda at large, feel free to drop them in the chat and I can do my best to answer them. But I'm really excited to hear from our community leaders that are here today. So I'm gonna step back.
And I realized I didn't introduce myself at all. I'm Dena'ak'e, I'm Navajo and Dena'ak'e. I'm zooming from the Dene territories of the interior and the community of Fairbanks, and I'm the executive director of Native Movement. And I am really excited to dive into this conversation with folks about tribal sovereignty. What do we need? How can we use this Thrive Act to strengthen tribal sovereignty in the eyes of the federal government, maybe, or because of course we know our inherent sovereignty and self-determination. Let's see, we've got some great folks on. And I might want to just, when you're ready to answer a question, if you can, remember to take a moment to introduce yourself. And I want to put also in here some agreements, group agreements. Since we're going to get into discussion, here's our group agreements. It's all about being respectful and listening for understanding, being mindful, knowing we're not going to solve it all today. Unlearning is as important as learning. Ouch, oops is if you feel like something hit you the wrong way or didn't rub you the wrong way, maybe just write in the chat, ouch. And maybe that person didn't mean to do that, but we'll figure out how to address that, right? Stories stay, lessons leave, and WAIT stands for why am I talking and why aren't I talking? So if you're not, push yourself to talk or push yourself to like hold up. All right, what's our first question, Chanel, to get us started?
Hey, it's a good one. What does tribal sovereignty look like for our Native people? And I would like to welcome anyone who feels compelled and ready to answer and then pass it on. I don't want to force anyone.
And the question is, what does tribal sovereignty look like for Alaska Native people? Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's right.
Looks like Natasha's ready to go.
Hi. If you hear a strange noise in the back, it's my little park here.
Amazing.
My name is Natasha Singh. I'm zooming in from Fairbanks, Alaska, and my bosses are 37 federally recognized tribes. I work for Dena'ina Chiefs Conference, and it's a tribal health and social services organization. So what does tribal sovereignty mean for Alaska Natives? I was having this conversation a few weeks ago on a national panel, and it kind of got me thinking about a panelist made the point that the sovereign, we didn't use sovereign and sovereignty before we had contact. This is a concept developed out of the Crown of England, that really the crown, the King of England, could do no harm, and they were always right. And we've kind of adopted those terms for our tribal governments, but they kind of don't really fit in easily, because our tribal governments and all human governments aren't perfect. We do wrong and we get things wrong, and that's okay, but we have our government systems in place to fix those. So I get why we're, as tribal governments, we're so protective of our word sovereign, because what it is we're saying is we're nations. We have a right just as much as any other nation, and we have a voice just as much as the United States government, and we should be listened to at that same level. And I completely believe in that as well. But I also believe in transforming that view of tribal governments can only be as great as our membership, as our information that we have access to, our resources we have access to. And in Alaska, unfortunately, tribes don't own lands, and we don't have jurisdiction of lands, and it makes it extremely challenging, because that doesn't allow for a lot of economic sovereignty. And then also our traditional territories are owned by largely private for-profit corporations that don't have an obligation to listen to our sovereign status. So tribal sovereignty in Alaska gets complicated, but if we have proposed legislation that seeks to include tribal governments in a way that allows for tribal members to become a part of a new economy, allows tribal infrastructure to rely on clean renewables, whereas in our tribes in interior Alaska solely rely on diesel for their electricity, and that really keeps us dependent on an unjust system. I think a legislation could really assist our tribal self-determination for Alaskans. So when I first started looking at this legislation, because Ine asked me to, I was very encouraged. But I think it kind of goes to show you too, like our tribes aren't necessarily involved with the legislation writing, probably because we're so busy. Our tribes are just so busy and we have very little resources. So engagement will be helpful for our tribes. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. You gave us a lot to think about there. There's so much to think about right there. I mean, I love that you touched on like economic sovereignty as well. I want to just pause to see if there are others that have joined us, our special invited guests on tribal sovereignty experts want to jump in on this at all.
I'm Sarita Chamelka. I'm Shauna Larson. I'm Sukhbi on my mom's side from the village of Port Graham and Atna on my dad's side from Chickaloon. Serve on the traditional tribal council as the vice chair and also serve as a tribal court judge. And Natasha, I really loved hearing you talk about that. It's just like recognizing that the idea of sovereignty is a colonizer's concept. And it's one of those things that is going to probably continue to make it very difficult for us to decolonize our minds and our bodies and ourselves. I think what it brings up for me is just how when I traveled to Cuba a few years ago, I had the opportunity to really see this whole new system. And I have served on my tribal council for about 15 years now. And I was very much raised in the thinking of the American Indian movement and, you know, the work that we do here in Alaska. I was raised by tribal leaders, and it just never dawned on me that when you're talking about sovereignty and self-determination, that there's really a third part to that equation. And I didn't learn that very clearly until I went to Cuba. And there I saw the third element, which is really this is about sovereignty, self-determination, and then the last piece is liberation. And I don't know that we spend a lot of time talking about liberation and what does that look like and what does it mean? And I think that it kind of takes us into the next, questions about how does further tribal sovereignty and self-determination in Alaska work, and what would maybe a healed relationship look like? So maybe it takes us to those places. Very interesting, though, thought-provoking.
Well, I'd love to dig more into that, right, a little bit there with folks, and I recognize there's a number of folks on the call that might want to jump in. Maybe, raise your hand or put in the chat like that you want to be on stack. But we're trying to give some of our tribal leadership, tribal governance experts some time to talk first, and then we'll have more opened up chat time. But something that both you and Natasha touched on, maybe digging a little deeper into it, is like, how do you feel like there is some federal legislation, there's a pathway through federal legislation that can really heal or strengthen Native nations' sovereignty and the relationship with the US? Like, what more could be done? And for example, I mean, one of the things that's in the Thrive Act that collaborators on the Thrive Act are really advocating for is free, prior, and informed consent, which is a part of the United Nations UNDRIP.
Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Get so used to saying it as an acronym. Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yeah. So, are there ways to kind of put some of those international kind of things that don't have as much teeth maybe in this country with between the U.S. and tribes. But are there some ways that you could think about it? And I know that this is like a loaded question because there's probably like a ton of things that can be done. But what comes to your mind at first? And land back, right? Lands, truth and reconciliation, or truth and conciliation.
Can you repeat the prompt?
I know I like said the prompt and then I said a whole bunch of other stuff. What could are there things within, are there some pieces that we could put into federal legislation, such as the Thrive Act, that could really strengthen or heal some of the relationships between the US and tribal sovereign nations?
I have an idea. What about being able to be enrolled in all your tribes, not just one? So like changing federal recognition to be able to benefit every one of your tribes. Because like, for example, my kids are enrolled here. They can't be enrolled back home. So they don't get to, even though bloodly by blood, they are Mandan Hidatsa, they can't, like, when I lost my kids, my tribe couldn't help me because my kids were not enrolled. Like, that's a huge issue that we don't really talk about, is how come we have this like paper genocide, calling it what it is. My kids are only 1/4 on paper, but 3/4 by blood.
That's great. Thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, enrollment is a huge issue across Alaska as well. In the new American Rescue Act, they requested tribal enrollment. First of all, the federal government requested tribal enrollment from Alaska tribes with like a 4-day business day turnaround, which our tribes just can't do. We're too small. Some tribes have 1 staffer, limited records, and so it was just unattainable. But yes, going back to tribal enrollment, it's really a pillar of sovereignty to determine who your tribal members are. And if there's barriers there, we should fix those. A lot of the barriers, though, are tribes themselves self-imposing those barriers because there's limits to resources. They don't necessarily want to. They want their lineal descendants to be able to be eligible for enrollment, but they put a limit on it because there's just not enough resources for the tribes. But a huge issue for tribes in Alaska is the systemic violence, as a symptom of colonialism. And it's such a huge barrier to everything we're trying to accomplish. Behavioral health is such a huge barrier to everything we're trying to accomplish. So if the Thrive Act could give our tribe back the authority to take care of some of our social issues, so that we could then be better able to deal with the big change that's about to happen, that would go a long ways to heal the relationship. Because unfortunately for a lot of our communities, we're in a state of chaos dealing with extreme violence. Our leaders know this huge change is about to come in the next 100 years, but they're held back by dealing with chaos of responding to violence. Chaos. We need that authority in federal law that tells us you have the power to deal with these violent perpetrators on your own, And we don't have to lock them up and throw them away because we know that system doesn't work. We can actually deal with them using a traditional behavioral health model that gets them off of substances and back into our community, because we need these people to help us get through the big change that's going to happen.
That's Natasha, just like mic drops all the time to the beat of some kids in the background. But I mean, thank you, Natasha. That we're gonna try to write that into this Thrive Act. But just, yeah, repeat. I just want to repeat that. I mean, I think the authority to manage, from the federal government, these social impacts, the social ills that, we might not necessarily readily connect them to climate change. But I think that's part also of some of the opportunity with the Thrive Bill. Not saying that we can do it all in this Thrive Act, but I think we want to try to incorporate that as much as we can. And of course into other federal legislation. But thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Natasha. Both of those were like, just want to open up if there's other things coming up for folks. As we think about strengthening tribal sovereignty here in Alaska, knowing the complexities also of Angska, and knowing the complexities in land. There are other thoughts on how we strengthen tribal sovereignty. Shauna?
Yeah, just having the state officially recognize tribes would be a great start, but also kind of going back and thinking about how tribes were originally under the War Department, and then they moved us under Department of Interior with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and just thinking about how, for example, the Army Corps of Engineers is under the Department of Interior, and we as tribes, we struggle with them so much. They really do. It's very difficult to negotiate any kinds of, when we do our government to government consultations with them, it's really difficult for us to continue trying to protect our lands because they're trying really hard to move forward. Yeah, it's definitely, I feel like, a conflict of interest, and it's awkward that DOI is trying to manage both of these things, and they can't. I don't think that they can really hold those things. And so I also wonder, what would it look like if corporations were, for example, maybe the leadership of corporations should go back to tribes.
Right, and I think that we can see some models like that in Alaska right now, right? I mean, there are some village corporations that the authority, and correct me if I'm wrong, I know there's a lot of tribal experts here, but tribal governance systems having the authority over the village corporations more directly.
I think the great example I always share with people is Tyonek, because we rent space from their building, and it was very interesting for me to watch that the corporation does not own the building, it's the tribe itself. And so the corporation was in the building, and then they were taking direction from the tribe, which I thought was just something that we don't see a whole lot of, and I liked it.
When I know we're Facebook Living this, so I don't know what others have to say, but I mean, I wonder what that model looks like on the regional level. Like, how does a regional corporation potentially become authorized under tribal governance. And we're just like, just thinking, of course, no. What could that be, Natasha?
Ine, if okay, so I think for federal legislation could incentivize a transition, because right now I think there are village corporations who would rather just dissolve, hand the assets over to the tribe, and the tribe manage the land and assets, maybe under a tribal entity or a different tribal arm or a tribal business or what have you. There are village corporations that want to do this. It just takes quite a few steps, and village corporations and tribes don't have that, the technical expertise to do all that. But if legislation kind of incentivized it, I think you would see a transfer of assets from village corporations to tribes. For the regionals, it gets more complicated though, because the ownership's individual shareholders, and oftentimes our shareholders, they might be also disenfranchised from their tribes, because for whatever reason, like we talked about before, maybe tribes aren't able to provide all their lineal descendants with enrollment or benefits because of the lack of resources for the tribes. So the regionals gets a little more complicated, but I think there is a lot of interest for villages to transfer to tribes. And legislation, we could propose some kind of legislation that incentivizes that.
I think also that a really important aspect of free, prior, and informed consent is that it creates these safeguards for community members and for tribes to take back that decision-making authority over their lands, regardless of who owns it. And so I'd really love to share a graphic that Jessie Thornton made. She's an incredible Alaskan artist, and we wanted to take, free, prior, and informed consent and think about what that looks like in Alaska. And really, it's a big way of saying, ask permission from the communities that will be impacted before you develop lands or manage lands. And in giving that community permission, they also have the ability to deny the use of those lands or waters for that project. I know that Shauna has advocated a ton for this, and this is really on the forefront of climate justice and environmental justice right now. And it's really exciting to see something like this in the Thrive agenda, because many other countries, other than, of course, the US, Canada, Mexico, have signed on to adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where this lives, but it hasn't happened here yet. Shauna?
Sure. So thanks for sharing this graphic. I love it. For many years, I was the daughter-in-law of Andrea Carmen, who is the executive director at the International Indian Treaty Council, and she and many others fought for many years at the UN to get UNDRIP passed, or the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. And they did things like have hunger strikes at the UN, where they actually starved themselves until the governments would negotiate with them. And so a lot has gone into this document. And my mother-in-law likes to say, the UN Declaration is the floor, it is not the ceiling. It is just a place to start from. And it really transcended and transformed the way that other governments from around the world started viewing Indigenous peoples and tribes in particular. And it was an opportunity for us from the United States to educate other countries about how we're treated here in the US and about what rights we really don't have. And so free prior informed consent just basically means, it reminds me, my son had very severe dyslexia, and one of his teachers said to him and myself and his dad, nothing about us without us. And so he was trying to tell my son, we're not going to do anything without talking to you first. We're not going to do anything until we have these conversations, these consultations with your family. And so I feel like, in particular for free prior informed consent, that's really what it means, is we have to consult with people because they're the experts on the land as Indigenous people. They're the experts of their area, and they're going to be the ones that have the solutions to the issues. They're going to be the ones that know the solutions on the ground.
Thank you, Shauna. And thank you for this image, really beautiful image. So we're taking notes, all of the great things that have been shared from, the state recognizing tribal nations to federal authority given to tribes to manage and handle their own social needs, to transferring of assets from village corporations to tribal governments. I'm wondering, as we think about transitioning Alaska's economy off of this heavily dependent on an oil and gas economy, as we think about a just and equitable transition, who are the others that we need to make sure are in the room for developing out this just transition agenda? And what ideas do you all have with really building out platforms or places from which to shape out this agenda, particularly around tribal sovereignty? Young people, elders. So say more, Margaret, like how could we, do people fill out surveys? Is that, do we do more forums? Like this is one way in which we're trying to garner feedback and info, but like, let's talk about all the ways we could be gathering input.
I see more of young people being voices as how we always talk about Indigenous knowledge not being truth or fact, and I think a lot of us we negate young people's ideas because they don't have experience in this world. But I think if we bring more young people and educate them on how to be engaged in ways that are productive, I think we just need to give more young people the tools that and I think it's the elders that need to lead that they have the tools that need to go to the young people. And I think the young people really need to have like for example, like on our board of directors, we need to have a young person sitting there. How is our young person, like where do we see, for example, like where do we see the corporation going, or where do we see this organization going, and how is this person going to bring it into the future? Like kind of really cultivating young leaders and bringing them to the table in bigger ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to just lift up all the great work that folks are doing in that realm, of course, right? Like, I mean, First Alaskans Institute with elders and youth, Tanana Chiefs Conference has a youth track. I mean, I think a lot of our organizations here have been really trying to bring more young people in, and also elders. So I think, and there's more that needs to be done, right? And I think you're right on with that, Margaret. Gwitch'in Steering Committee. And yeah, I guess I'm opening up the floor right now to really just get chatty about how are we really going to get more input in building a just and equitable transition to a regenerative economy.
Building off of Margaret's comment, I would love if our tribe picked their selected cohorts from each community of young people, and we brought them in, and they told us whatever reason that, and how that we can contribute to this transition, and how our people can really heal during this transition, and what's needed. What are the components that are needed? I think Margaret has, I agree with her, it has to be from the youth. And I think what maybe the problem we're doing is we just pick off a few youth, and they're not maybe leading or informing, at least at the tribal level. It's mostly just getting them involved in other issues. But what I liked about our Just Transition Summit from last year is we had a young people's group that were just so dynamic. Like, that's kind of what I'm thinking of for tribes that are about tribes at that level. So thank you, Margaret, for saying that.
Yeah, thank you both. Thanks, Natasha. Thanks for staying with us, Natasha, while you're traveling, wherever you're at. The great thing about Zoom. I want to call on Kendra too, who's been kind of quiet there. Kendra with Native Peoples Action, if she wants to jump in on any of this discussion, but.
Yeah, this has been a really good discussion, and yeah, I'm a little quiet because I am also doing kid pickups. So I've got my two kiddos in the car with me. So, something that I really think on though is having these conversations about just transition during tribal assembly, thinking about additional youth gatherings and how we can support that, and that's something that I really support, and a lot of what is said here. It's just bringing this conversation up in a lot of different spaces and getting that additional feedback. Tribal input is so incredibly important, and that's some of the work I know that a lot of the Just Transition Collective is working on doing right now. And so I think talks like this are great, but going into the spaces where all our tribal citizens are, going into the spaces where they are, whether it be tribal assembly or, we have, for me, I'm, See Alaska, we have different meetings and conversations there. So bringing up with our regional corporations too, I think is important. So being in all these different spaces, having these conversations, bringing these questions to our tribal leaders, it's just something I've been thinking on. So thank you. I'm glad to be here and good to kind of see you all in the Zoom world. I can't wait to be able to hug everybody and have these fireside chats in person and over a real fire.
Thanks, Kendra. I think it's really interesting also that we're all if I can, I don't know some people's pronouns on this call, but like seems to be a lot of women, femme folks, indigenous women leaders on this call. Interesting. Juggling your kids and speaking. Go for it, Natasha.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say, Ine, is we almost need to bring in our Native men. I had pulled into one of my friend's driveways, and he's a traditional hunter fisher, but he also is in one of our labor unions. And so out on his yard, I think he was opposed to taxing the oil companies or something that him and I just didn't agree on. But I was thinking, like, he's living in an economy where he's relying on his traditional food resources, but he also needs a good job. So I think if we want to bring in our tribes, it should be like bringing our providers, bringing them in for a discussion about what can their jobs be in this new economy? What are the energy jobs we're talking about? What is the infrastructure going to be like? And how can we utilize our providers in this transition? And then we'll have the men engaged. But maybe maybe that's a step for to get men engaged, but also our tribe. Men are, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry to interrupt you, Natasha. I was just going to add, one of the things that Chickaluna has done is we run the Yanida'a tribal school. And so we work to educate our kids right from the beginning. And I never really thought about it. It didn't ever really dawn on me until I did send my daughter to public school. And it was not until the 3rd grade. And she went in and, the first question she asked when she came home was, she said, everybody said this thing and they all knew the words, but I didn't. And she said, what does it mean to pledge your allegiance? And so just thinking about like what her experience was going into public schools and how the colonization impacts continue all the way through college, really, when you think about fraternities and sororities and how those people engage in Congress and with their friends for the rest of their lives. It's very different, I think, than what it is, that we're looking for. And so I think too, I see your comment, Courtney, and I don't disagree. I come from a community where the people that are running, the family that are running the corporation are really corporate. And then the people who are running the tribe are really traditional. And we have a really hard time meeting in the middle. But I don't disagree. It would be great if they did work together.
Thank you all for offering up these thoughts. We've been on this track for a bit now, and I wanted to hear for my own personal, I don't know what to call it. I want to hear, Chanel wants to hear about your thoughts on healthcare for your different indigenous populations. And this we have to wrap soon, so I'll try to summarize. I'm living in the city right now because there was no mental health care available for me in the village. I couldn't even teleconference into somebody with reasonable rates to get mental health care. I'm wondering what pinpoints there are with people you work with that could improve healthcare for the people you care about. Yeah.
I was actually just talking to my friend about this, and she's from out of state, but she's a native, and she said what would be the most effective would be to have an open walk-in clinic for behavioral health needs, because we don't have that. You know, like it took me a long time to get into behavioral health. You know, it's like it's a process. You know, you have to do assessment, then you have to do this, and then you have to do that. But if you're having a crisis at that moment, what do? Then that's when you freak out, and that's when the police are called, and that's, you know, and that's, you know, if there was like a drop-in BH health center, or like, you know, maybe a traditional healing drop-in, that would be amazing to have our you know, our traditional healers like just be available whenever we need them, you know, on a regular basis.
Great ideas. Even here in the city, like I had to wait for 4 weeks to get an appointment with an actual like doctor at South Central. And I don't even know what a traditional healing drop-in would look like, but I am intrigued. I'd like to hear more thoughts from you, Margaret, one-on-one. Does anyone else have something to offer here? Bits of nuggets that you see that like are available in other places that aren't available in villages or rural areas, things like that.
So this is Natasha. I work for Tribal Health, and behavioral health is our #1 priority. It's also our #1 issue that's underfunded. And there is a huge lack of human resources actually across the country on behavioral health specialists. So I think we have to grow our own. We have to start turning out licensed professional behavioral health clinicians that are rooted in their own traditions, so that they can understand that the Western model of counseling and therapy is necessary. It is necessary, but it's only one component of what we actually need to achieve wellness, and that we need so much more. But the facts are, there are no counselors. We can't recruit to the village. We can't recruit to Fairbanks. We can't recruit to Anchorage even for these professionals. We have to grow our own. The best thing about COVID that came out of this horrible, horrific pandemic is we got better at telehealth. The feds loosened up their regulations, and they are allowing tribal health and other entities to bill for telehealth. Because the resources are so scarce, we have to be able to bill for it. And when we're not able to bill for it, we just can't multiply those resources like we need to. So telehealth is going to start being more readily available to our villages. ANTHC is releasing a statewide behavioral health program hopefully this summer. But we have identified the same priority. We need drop-in behavioral health in all of our hubs. We need broadband, and that would be something important for the Thrive Act. If we have high-speed internet in all of our communities and all of our homes, if you're having a mental health crisis, you're one Zoom call away from somebody who's trained in the language that can help you, and that hopefully you can, if necessary, you can be on the next plane out if that's what is being called for. But we're dealing with a crisis right now, a behavioral health crisis, a substance abuse crisis, and our community, our society is sick because of this awful economy. And if we have legislation that addresses this specifically for Native communities, it would go a long way healing our relationship.
Yes. Hell yeah. Thank you, Natasha, for offering up your expertise. That's a lot more information than I knew like 2 minutes ago, and I can't thank you enough. All right. Any closing thoughts from folks here before we move into a close for the day? Shauna, is that you? Did you want to? No?
Nope, I'm good. Just having a little snack.
Oh, I love it. Nutrition for the mind, nutrition for the body. All right. So we've chatted about a lot today in regards to this Thrive Act pillar of nation-to-nation relationships. In closing, I want to say that like even an individual level, I don't know what you need until you tell me, and then vice versa. You don't know what I need until I tell you. And then even when we say what we need, like the pathway to get there, we can have totally different concepts in our head. So in order to get to this like envisioned goal, I think we're doing what we need to be doing right now, which is chatting with each other. That's it for me. Ruth, do you want to give more for, I think we have like a survey for you. Sorry.
You closed that perfect. That all of this is about dialogue. It's all about learning from each other and taking the time to ask each other, what do you need? What do I need? And how do we get it together? And how do we build for the future so that those that come after us won't have those needs? They'll be in a better place to thrive. And so if folks are like eager to really get into the nitty gritty of the Thrive Act and are have a million thoughts running, just want to put it down on paper, I put the link of a survey, which is like not our Indigenous choice of communication, but nonetheless, it's one of many options to give feedback and to engage with this text in a closer way. And so in the survey, you can submit it and edit it again. So instead of closing your laptop, make sure you do that because you might lose your work. And you can also skip questions that you don't want to answer. But there you'll find different pillars of the act, and it'll ask you like, what does this look like to you? Do you know who's doing this work? What more work needs to be done here? Is this a good fit for Alaska? Things like that. We're going to continue having these dialogues, which I'm really excited about, every Tuesday and Thursday for the rest of the month, and the first Tuesday of May as well. And so next Tuesday we'll be meeting on Pillar 5, which is on averting environmental catastrophe. So I really, really hope that we see some familiar faces and lots of new faces. You can go to the Just Transition Collective Facebook page and the events column to find all of those events. The Zoom link is going to be the exact same. Please, please, please invite everyone you know, because this was such an amazing conversation. It'd be great to have a million more. And so Chicken, thank you all for being here. Ine, do you have last things to say before we sign off?
Just gratitudes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll see you all soon. Thank you for joining us. Bye.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you, Shauna. Thank you, Natasha.